I will now call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 61 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format. All witnesses have completed the required connection tests prior to the meeting. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before taking the floor. All comments should be addressed to the chair. I would ask members to raise their hand if you wish to speak, whether in person or via Zoom. The committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain speaking order. So, in keeping with Section 102.2 and the motion adopted by the committee 24 September 2024, our subcommittee is starting its study on transnational repression in developing democracies. As we see in the title of this session, I would like to remind my colleagues and our witness that the scope of this study is foreign, not domestic.
Hope, and I would like to inform you all that the purpose of our study today is international, not domestic one. Thank you. J'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à nos témoins.
I would like to wish welcome to our witnesses from the Tamil Rights Group, Uma Ruthi Rimorski, and she is here with us in person.
Hong Kong Foundation, Mr. France Huy, coordinateur de la politique de plaidoyer. Un maximum de 5 minutes vous sera accordé par...
You have a maximum of 5 minutes for your opening statements. That will be followed by a question period. So, very big welcome to Uma Ruthi Rimorski. Please give your opening statements for a maximum of 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity to discuss ongoing issues affecting Elam Tamils in Sri Lanka and abroad.
Pardon, point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order. Could we start again with the microphone being opened because the interpreter was... yes.
Elam Tamils have a long history of being subjected to disenfranchisement and human rights violations. And when the war ended in 2009, the Sri Lankan government seized the opportunity to oppress Elam Tamils further by detaining displaced persons in detention camps, many of which were subjected to rape, torture, inhumane and brutal treatment. The death toll and the blatant genocidal acts of the Sri Lankan government against Elam Tamils over the 26 years of war and at the camps is clearly demonstrated in the discovery of roughly 32 mass graves. Tensions still exist in the country with heavy military presence in the Tamil northern and eastern areas of Sri Lanka. And in 2022, it was recorded that there was a ratio of 1 soldier to every 4 civilians, enabling de facto authority in the north. Intimidation tactics by the Sri Lankan government served to silence civilians in Sri Lanka and abroad from speaking up against any mistreatment. However, recent disturbing reports are emerging with incidents of arbitrary detainments, religious persecution, land grabbings, police brutality, torture and murder. Recently, shocking reports emerged of a mother and her baby being assaulted by the Sri Lankan police. Earlier this year, 8 individuals and a priest were arbitrarily detained and assaulted for simply worshipping and celebrating a religious festival at the Vadukanari Hindu temple. In 2023, a student named Alex Nagarasa had been arbitrarily detained and tortured at a local police station. Like many youth of today, Alex took to social media to reveal his torture and was subsequently brutally murdered. Earlier this year, mothers of victims of enforced disappearances were arrested and arbitrarily detained for merely continuing in their protest. There have been numerous accounts recorded by the UN of intimidation, harassment, and surveillance towards victims and victims' families who live in constant fear of repercussions. There is a complete lack of support for victims, especially for families of enforced disappearances. Rudimentary mechanisms have been put in place, such as the OMP, that lacks the resources, capacity, and powers to investigate. At the heart of this issue is the lack of independence and the impunity of perpetrators. War criminals have not only received impunity, but many have been promoted to high-ranking or prominent positions in government, which has subsequently heavily influenced the judiciary. The Sri Lankan government has not resolved the issue of its draconian Prevention of Terror Act and the Anti-Terror Bill, of which the UN has recognised in being direct violation of several UN human rights conventions. The enactment of additional draconian laws, such as the Bureau Rehabilitation Act, the NGO Registration and Supervision Act, and the Online Safety Act, further enable the arbitrary detainment of individuals and the persistent monitoring by the Sri Lankan government over civil society groups. Such draconian laws serve as legislative tools to quash dissent and diminish fundamental freedoms for Ulam Tamils in Sri Lanka and abroad. The Sri Lankan government has attempted to silence diaspora globally. Victims of the Sri Lankan government's atrocities who come forward to share their testimonies are often subjected to retaliation, with family members back home put on surveillance, threatened, and intimidated. Civil society groups significantly operate with a sense of fear, as the Sri Lankan government regularly publishes gazettes that include the names of foreign nationals known to oppose the regime and labelling them as terrorists. Many diaspora Tamils have experienced issues travelling to other countries and being denied entry or being mistreated upon entry to Sri Lanka, such as arbitrary detainment, police brutality, torture, and other humane practices as a means of global intimidation. We would like to make 4 key recommendations. Canada should actively support the work of the UNHRC Sri Lanka Accountability Project and advocate to broaden their mandate. Second, Canada should broaden its sanctions to include more individuals linked to the Sri Lankan government. Third, many civil society groups, including Tamil rights groups, have called on the Canadian government to pursue legal action at the ICJ. And finally, Tamil rights groups has formally requested Canada to support its Article 15 submission to the ICC. Thank you.
Good timing. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Madame Lee to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. Madame Lee, you could start.
Good afternoon.
Good
Chair.
afternoon, yes.
Good afternoon, Chair Okoye, Vice Chair Lake, Vice Chair Bruno Josep, and distinguished member of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Frances Hui, and I am from the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, which campaigns for the freedom of political prisoners in Hong Kong. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I have been advocating for its democratic development since I was 14 years old. In 2020, after China imposed its national security law in Hong Kong, I sought asylum in the United States due to the risk of arrest for my international advocacy. Now based in Washington, D.C., I continue to speak out on the Chinese government's abuse in Hong Kong and beyond. Last year, the Hong Kong authorities issued an arrest warrant and placed a $1 million Hong Kong bounty on my head under the national security law. This illustrates how the Chinese Communist Party deploys transnational repression to silent dissent, targeting not only activists like me, but also Uyghurs, Tibetans, Taiwanese, and Chinese dissidents globally. The Freedom House identifies the CCP's campaign of transnational repression as the world's most comprehensive. Its methods include spyware, intimidation, disinformation, surveillance, and threats against dissidents' family members back home, all designed to suppress dissent far beyond its borders. A key player in this strategy is the CCP's United Front Work Department, which controls and mobilizes organizations and individuals on the party's behalf. The Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices, the HKETOs, located in Toronto and around the world, are operating with quasi-diplomatic status to promote Beijing's narrative influence foreign policies, and monitor dissidents abroad. In 2019 and 2020, a US citizen in Boston was tasked by Beijing to spy on my activities. He had attended my events, taken photos and videos, and shared them directly with PRC officials. But this man was not just spying on me. Between 2018 and 2022, he provided intelligence about members and leaders of Chinese family associations and community organizations and anti-CCP dissidents to the PRC officials, including those at the United Front. In one instance, he mobilized hundreds of pro-Beijing individuals to counter-protest our march in August 2019. Some of the people vandalized our belongings and physically intimidated us. These people had openly discussed bringing weapons to attack the participants and even firearms to quote-unquote shoot her in the face. After the rally, I was followed home and I had to call the police twice for assistance. The repression didn't stop here. After Hong Kong issued a bounty for my arrest last year, the harassment intensified. A week later, my parents in Hong Kong was brought in for police questioning. I regularly received phone calls from Chinese-speaking men who know my name. These tactics aim to isolate and intimidate with profound psychological, social, and political impacts. I think today's hearing is so critical because Canada, with its large diaspora communities, is particularly vulnerable to transnational repression and foreign interference. It is crucial to take timely and decisive action to address this issue and protect both your citizens and national security. I urge Canada make full use of its sanction authorities to hold bad actors accountable. It should also consider revoking the HKETOs diplomatic immunities and privileges, as it has now become an outpost for the Chinese government to surveil and propagandize its own agenda on Canadian soil. And I will lay other policy recommendations later on in the question section. As I testified today, 45 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, some of them close friends of mine, have recently been sentenced to 4 to 10 years in prison for organizing a democratic primary election. This is the grim reality of life under authoritarian rule, but the repression goes beyond, as you have heard. My story is just one example of how Beijing's transnational authoritarianism, driven by tools like the United Front and the HKETOs, threatens freedom and democracy worldwide. Lastly, I would like to applaud this Parliament for passing the Countering Foreign Interference Act in June this year. I think it was a great step forward, and I hope the government will continue to take meaningful and leading steps to protect individuals and your sovereignty from transnational repression. I appreciate the committee's efforts in addressing this issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Excellent timing. I would like to thank both witnesses. And now I would like to open the floor for debate for a question and answer. And I'd like to invite Mr. Ihsasi to take the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Very grateful to the two witnesses who have taken the time to appear before us today. If I could start off with Ms. Huey, good to see you. You have been indefatigable for so long. It's incredible to see how engaged and how active you have been as a human rights activist. Given that the topic of this study is transnational repression, you did talk about some chilling incidents where an individual in Boston was harassing you. I was wondering if that made it in the media, whether there's any additional information you could send our way, because this is truly unacceptable. So would it be possible for you to follow up with more information as to how the media covered these incidents?
Yes, definitely. So, in fact, the U.S. Department of Justice last year indicted this Massachusetts man, and the indictment is up online, and the trial continues to happen. I believe he received some sort of he's bailout right now with some condition, and I can definitely follow up with you with the information. But as it was happening in 2019, obviously there were a lot of media coverage on the protests that I was mentioning. It was organized in Boston in support of the protest that was happening in Hong Kong. And what made it so profoundly terrifying is that before we organized this rally in August, we started off in June. That's when the movement happened in Hong Kong. And from that period of time, from June to August, we have never seen such coordinated and large opposition from any sort of attention from the Chinese community at all. And it was all peaceful. People are well received, very welcoming with knowing more about this issue. But then in August, when that march happened, it got so much attention, and not only the rally in Boston was facing this kind of backlash. There are protests on the same day in Australia, and I believe some of them were in Canada and Vancouver and Toronto. All of the people who attended those rallies witnessed violent attempts from the other side. And I think this draws lines, and for us to see the global scope of transnational repression by the CCP, is that the United Front Work Department, they are essentially an international network, and they work with local organizers and their people on the ground in different countries to coordinate these campaigns of intimidation and threats against the pro-democracy activists on the ground. So I thought this is another information that I would like to share with the committee, and I think it demonstrates how large the influence of CCP are in our society, and so it brings us to see that this issue needs to be tackled not just in a domestic in Canada, but Canada should also collaborates with other countries multilaterally to tackle this issue.
Absolutely. But also, if I could touch on something else you shared with us, you did say that you approached the police to report this. Were the police helpful, and did they provide you any additional information as to whether this individual, they had received complaints from others regarding this very same individual, and what the scope of his activities were?
So when I found out I was followed by the man, I called the police, and they intervened and basically told him to step away. And I continued to go on to return to my home, and then I saw the same person come back to me and continue to follow me. And so I called the police again, and they intervened and asked him to go. I asked, and when I talked to the officer, he said because it is not a repetitive pattern, they can't arrest this person, they can't do anything about it. And from that, I think I see, a problem with, a lack of training with our, police and the local police and law enforcement about transnational repression. Is that because the situation is that a lot of times these things doesn't happen, like it's not conducted by only one person. It's conducted by multiple people that are under the network of United Front, and it's really hard to track if we only if we're only targeting one person and see their they only started this as the time we can make action. And we know that at the afterwards I was contacted by the investigative agencies about this, and I learned that after COVID, that person who were following me went back to China and he never come back. And so even though the US was able, certain agencies were able to identify him as spying on me under the order of the United Front or the Chinese government, they were not able to enforce or any law, or they were not able to take any actions because that person has already left the country, and they're never going to never going to come back because China is just going to swap another person in now that they know this person has gotten the attention. So that was, it was a terrifying experience. And again, it instilled a lot of anxiety to my life since then. And I think it shows kind of the lack of actions and lack of trainings among agencies on this issue on transnational repression. And I think right now, in the past few years, we have improved a little more with more trainings. But I think a lot more needs to be done, and the definition of transnational repression needs to be written in the law, and these acts should be criminalized.
Very much looking very much forward to the follow-up information you're going to be sending us. Very grateful.
Thank you, Mr. I would like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your testimony today. If I could start with you, Francis, your testimony was gripping, particularly in the context of the experience you've had with the Communist Party at your doorstep. Let me ask you, if you don't mind putting you on the spot a little bit, to take a stab at defining what transnational repression is, not just having experienced it, but obviously having a chance to engage with others who have had to deal with similar strains. If you were going to try and put your arms around it and give it a definition, what would that be?
Well, I think it's a transnational repression is very sophisticated method of interference. It's hard to say it in one sentence, but I will try. I think it's an effort to silence exiles and diaspora abroad, to silence their voice in a way to break down communities, to instill untrust, and break up the communities that are going to eventually become a momentum of some dissent and movement. And they will use a spectrum of tactics from assassination, intimidation, threats, and also taking hostage of family members back home, all in a way to silence dissent. That's what I would say. And I think it's important that we remember transnational repression has gotten much larger scale and in a global, globally, because with the emergence of technology, spyware, and AI, it makes it so it make the cost so low for the foreign governments, for authoritarian states to continue with this act, with these type of repression, and with harassment and disinformation campaigns on social media, to threatening phone calls on Google, on Zoom. It just became so much easier to conduct by authoritarian states.
That's excellent, and I think you did a fantastic job for just being put on the spot for that. Let me then ask you a little bit further about the tools that you see regimes deploy. You had the high-cost tools of the United Front Work Department that obviously moves people and personnel around the world to impose that repression on nationals that they claim are of Chinese origin. And then you touched a little bit on digital tools. I'm sure there are some commercial coercive tools at play as well. You mentioned in your opening statement that you'd have some policy recommendations on how to deal with those tools, those modern tools of repression. Would you take a minute to unpack that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I would take the priority to mention the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices. I mentioned earlier that it's all located around the world. There's one in Canada and in Toronto. There are 3 in the US, and they're overseas representative offices of the Hong Kong government. And in the lead up to the British transfer of Hong Kong to China in 1997, the Canadian government granted the HKETO special privileges and immunities that are exactly the same for consular posts in recognition of Hong Kong's autonomy from China. And so I think right now there are a few problems we see is that they have evolved to serve other purpose, to create and promote propaganda for Hong Kong and China, and tracking Hong Kong dissidents abroad. There are a lot of examples that back what I have just said about the tracking, the surveillance, and the influence in public policies. So I'm not going to go into it, but I'm happy to provide those information after the hearing. So I think we have to now acknowledge that Hong Kong previously known autonomy, it's gone. And we should start asking about the question, why are we giving China two separate diplomatic representation in Canada, in the US, in the UK, and etc., right? And there are some legislative actions behind this idea in the US, and in Canada, there is a recent petition presented by Jenny Kwan MP that it also includes an ask for to revoke the special immunities and privileges of the HKETO, and I hope that members of the parliament would take that as one of the way to tackle this issue, to shut the HKETO down and to take their diplomatic status away. That would be the one spotlight that I highlight.
Thank you. We'll look forward to you tabling those documents and your recommendations as you've proposed to have a chance to go into it deeply. If you don't mind, in my last minute with you, Uma, the new government in Sri Lanka has some interesting characters around the table. To what degree do you believe that they would deploy tools of transnational repression to Tamil Eelam populations around the world?
What I think will happen is they'll just continue business as normal. At this moment in time, we still have the Sri Lankan gazettes where people are specifically listed. There's always a potential, even for myself, to be listed on that list in the future. But we're seeing things in Canada already with the Brampton Memorial and, things just generally happening with the genocide recognition here in Canada. So things will continue on. Yes, I know there's, people are thinking it's kind of hopeful there's a new government, there's going to be change. But we always have to remember that this party is an old party that's been around a while, and it's a Sinhala Buddhist nationalist party that has always been anti-reconciliation and has in the past, especially in the 90s, sought out to tarnish any peace talks. So I think, they're just going to continue on as normal and they're not going to stop. We're already seeing it here in Canada. Gazette lists, even individuals going over there doing humanitarian work are being, subjected to inhumane treatment. And as you can see, like I mentioned in my statement, there's new legislation that's come about with the new NGO Act over there and the Bureau Rehabilitation Act. All that means is that anyone who speaks up out anywhere in Sri Lanka or outside is subjected to, detainment by the army. It's giving this de facto authority to the army to arrest anyone if they speak out against the government. I really don't believe there will be any change. There's been a long history with the JVB party of diminishing any dissent, and I don't believe anything different is going to happen. They're just going to continue business as normal in order to repress any dissent locally or globally.
Thank you. I would like to invite Mr. J'aimerais inviter Monsieur.
I would like to invite Alexis Prunel-Duceppe to take the floor. Thank you to our witnesses who are here for this very important study. Ms. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. I think that you've made the demonstration in your opening statement and also in your answers to colleagues that transnational repression takes on a different face, and many different approaches are used to arrive at the same objective, that is threats, intimidation against the diaspora. It's a coincidence, but last night on Radio Canada, our national broadcaster, there was a reportage on the triads, the gangs in Vancouver, Toronto, also Australia, United Kingdom. And what we learned in this documentary is that the Communist Party, using amongst others the United Front that you've mentioned, have worked with members of organized crimes, these infamous triads, And this with the purpose of transnational repression. Are you aware of that approach used by the Communist Party? And if so, can you explain further to this committee?
Well, thank you for the question. I do not have a lot of information about this. I think a lot of the times the groups that United Front Department work with are, as I said, very community-based organizations. They could disguise as a restaurant, a community organization, family association, scholar association, student association. They are so infiltrated, and they will implant their people into each organization in a way to surveil the activities happening within those groups, and to influence their thoughts and to control what they are doing. I would just speak on the case of the person that I mentioned that was indicted, who was indicted by the DOJ in the U.S. He was the founder of Overseas Chinese Association in Boston, and he apparently have used the organization to participate with events that was organized by the United Front. He was kind of like a leader of the community, the Chinese community in Boston, and he obviously have network with other Chinese associations in Boston and New York, and that's how he was able to pull together the counter protest in August 2019. So I think their strategy is quite similar to what you described, is that they will use these local groups that looks very innocent to continue, to carry out their acts of repression. And these things oftentimes are higher risk than we thought, because a lot of the people, they come to the U.S., they migrate, they come out of China, but they continue to live under this the surveillance of China, and it's hard to tell whether they are targeted only until they go back to China and they receive intimidations by the state officials and arrest or threats as they return to China. And I think this could also happen in Canada with some of the ordinary Canadians who found something absurd and they want to share on social media. And the censor of the Chinese government are going to detect all the content online, and we wouldn't know whether we are targeted. And for an ordinary citizen, an ordinary Canadian citizen, who have criticized the government, if they ever travel to China, they would perhaps receive that level of intimidations as well.
Thank you for that very complete answer, which will no doubt help our analysts. Perhaps another aspect, you mentioned the name of Jenny Kwan, a Vancouver East member of Parliament. I've worked with her on another committee, Immigration Committee, and we had a study on retirement funds of Hong Kong residents who decided to leave Hong Kong permanently, who was found residents in Canada or the UK. But unfortunately, it's been impossible for them to use or dip into their pension plans because the Hong Kong government have changed the rules, and Sun Life or other insurance companies cannot adapt to the new insurance parameters. So these individuals can no longer access their pension plans, and Canada insurance plans cannot modify their insurance parameters. Now, do you see this as transnational repression? You use insurance companies that have head offices around the world, and involuntarily, these insurance companies are being exported, used for transnational repression. It's the Hong Kong government that makes it impossible for these citizens to access their pension funds. Could you let us know?
Answer because 25 seconds remain only.
Yes, well, I would say definitely, and not just with insurance companies. I think with a lot of the private corporation that are not controlled or monitored, required by law to register their activities with the Chinese and Hong Kong government. Yes, I think they are. The Hong Kong and Chinese government continuously are sending warnings to private corporations and companies to coerce them to cooperate with them to commit transnational repression on people that have left Hong Kong and China. That's happening in a lot of cases that we have seen.
Renee Dissep, I would like to invite Mr. John to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
For their testimony. And I wanted to start with Ms. Wei. You talked about, well, first I want to thank you for your courage, for sharing your lived experience. And if you feel comfortable, can you speak about the mental health impact that the repressive tactics that you've experienced have had both on you and your loved ones? And do you feel, I know you're in the U.S. and it is different, but can you also, talk about how, what supports are available to individuals dealing with these extremely challenging stressors, and maybe what gaps you think need to be filled?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question. I think I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of psychological impacts that transnational repression has on victims. And personally, I think it creates a lot of anxiety. And I think the moment when I learned about the bounty that was placed on my head, there's like a flood of anxiety and paranoia that I should perhaps up my home security. I have to set up cameras around my house to avoid break-in. And I remember the first few weeks that I walked out of my house, I would always be very cautious about my surrounding. And I think that's absurd because, people like me who have left Hong Kong or from an authoritarian state, we come here to seek for safe haven, refuge from authoritarian rule. And ended up, we are seeing that these safe havens, although we're allowed to stay, these safe havens are becoming increasingly unsafe because of the transnational repression. There is an impact on personal level, and there are impacts on community because there is a climate of fear that making people who are they are scared to speak up. They start to silence themselves. They stay away from absorbing any news or information about their home. They cut ties with each other, especially from those who are targeted. I remember when I received the bounty, some of my friends reach out to me and say, Francis, I'm sorry, I have to unfriend you on social media. Because we're afraid to be associated with you. But and I understand that because that the fear is valid. That fear is it's from this this transnational repression, and unsure whether they would also be targeted because they are associated with me. So I think there are impacts on the community, and so it's a whole strategy to kind of break down the community efforts against the regime. And about the support that I receive in the US, I think it was really helpful when I were facing these threats and intimidation. The investigative law enforcement agencies, they reach out to me and allow me to know some of the unclassified information, and so that I am aware of the threats that I'm facing, and that I could ask them, what kind of things that I should do to protect myself. And they would teach me and give me trainings about how I can protect myself to ensure my safety. I think that's very helpful, and I think this is something Canada should also provide, is victim support and the exchange of information, intelligence with the community as well.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Do you feel that, women dissidents facing transnational repression, experience unique threats? I think you've identified some of that. And gender-based violence is still sadly pervasive in society, and you've described some pretty frightening encounters. What more can be done? You talked about some of what can be done to ensure the safety of and prevent the silencing of women political activists and human rights defenders. And maybe, Uma, if you want, you could start, and then I'll go to Ms. White.
In terms of what's happening here in terms of gender violence, you mean? And
yeah, just in terms of women that are facing transnational repression, how their experience is unique.
No, it is definitely unique because there's always this fear when you travel into Sri Lanka that something might happen to you, or if you decide to do any sort of humanitarian work, there's always a possibility that you'll be detained as soon as entering the country, and there's no way of knowing when you're going to be released, and there's a possibility of being tortured. So obviously, gender violence is at the heart of this issue, especially for women working in this field. For me personally, I have not been doing this for very long. I've only been doing it for a few years. But when we travelled to the UN, to Geneva this February, we were meant to represent witnesses with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, and it just turned out at the very last minute that none of our witnesses were able to attend, and excuses were given as to why each witness couldn't attend. We were made to feel like something could potentially happen to us. One witness wasn't able to come because of travel issues. Someone's car broke down. So we were very much made to feel like, is something going to happen to us to stop us from going to the UN? So as women, we are constantly in fear working in this realm. Individuals in our organisation have been listed on the Sri Lankan Gazette, and that's always something, this pending fear for anyone working in this realm. At the moment you get on that Gazette, that's it. Your life is in danger.
Thank you. Ms. Hui, you talked about my colleague Jenny Kwan, who tabled a petition in the House of Commons calling on the Minister of Foreign Affairs to withdraw any privileges and immunities granted to the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in Canada. Can you share your thoughts on that? And also, how can foreign governments effectively counter transnational repression by the PRC while managing economic and political pressure at the same time?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the HKETO it's imposing a lot of threats in Canada and the U.S. and other host countries that they are based in. Just a few examples to elaborate on my previous response. They have been very active in.
Can you wrap it up 10 seconds, please, only?
Sure. Well, they are tracking Hong Kong dissidents abroad, and I think they should not deserve diplomatic, representation in Canada, and so their diplomatic status should be revoked, and they should be shut down in Canada.
Now, we would like to go for the second round, and I would like to invite Mr. Lake to take the floor for 3 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Francis, I was pulling up the article from Boston.com from 2019 and just struck by the fact that you were expressing, I am from Hong Kong, not China, and that you opened with the line, I'm from a city owned by a country I don't belong to, and simply for expressing your identity, your reality, as you've experienced it. You've gone through everything that you've gone through, and your family's facing the threats that they're facing, and I'll start by just commending your incredible courage as you're speaking your reality publicly. My question, because I have a very short time, I'm curious, as I'm listening to both of you speak, I'm curious what connection there might be between the two. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, to what extent might China or the CCP be involved in what's happening in Sri Lanka, and maybe in other places? Maybe Francis wants to chat about other places around the world. But is there anything? I mean, Uma, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Or?
Well, it's a very loaded question, and me answering it is also putting me somewhat in danger. But yes, China does have a huge influence in Sri Lanka economically.
Francis, can I ask you the same question, whether it's Sri Lanka or other countries? And then, because I probably won't get another chance to weigh in, what I'm also curious about as you contemplate that is whether there might be some form of coordination. I mean, we know there's probably some form of coordination, but maybe to what extent would there be coordination between Russia and Iran and the CCP and North Korea in some of these attempts around the world to repress people, whether they're from Hong Kong or originally from China or otherwise?
Well, yeah, thank you for your question, and thank you so much for pulling out the article that I authored in 2019. It was a long time ago, and I was thank you very much for highlighting that. I do not have a lot of information about, with examples of how countries work together to conduct transnational repression. I would just say that from my research and from my observation, China has a pattern of using Interpol to hunt down activists and dissidents. That was a concern raised when I received the arrest warrant. I wasn't sure if countries, if it's safe for me to travel. And I would have to be very aware of going to any other countries that have extradition agreement with China. And so I'm avoiding those countries from my list because of that. And I cannot speak on the,
Please wrap it up, 10 seconds, please.
But I know that China is working really closely with Russia and Iran and North Korea and these authoritarian states on all sort of things, including using Hong Kong as a sanction evasion hub for these countries.
Now I invite Madame Anita Vandenberg to take the floor for 8 minutes, please.
Chair. And again, I want to start with both of you to thank you very much for your determination to continue your advocacy despite the threats that you get. But my question right now is for Uma. I want to pick up on the Interpol thing because you said something that is really striking. You said there is a gazette of names of foreign nationals, and that these foreign nationals then, because they're listed as terrorists, may have difficulty traveling around the world and other things. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit about this. And, you said it's foreign nationals from around the world. Like, what countries would they be in? What's the purpose of this gazette? Is it open and public? Is it something that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so the Sri Lankan Gazette actually lists any individual that speaks up against the government as terrorists. They're actually listed as terrorists just for questioning the government. And this is any individual globally. So it's something you really do need to keep an eye on if you ever wish to travel to Sri Lanka, because it's not a simple case. If you went there, you'd just be, questioned or imprisoned. There's a possibility of getting tortured. So it's a done deal. The moment your name is listed on the Gazette, you can never enter Sri Lanka. We actually have individuals in our organisation that are listed on the Gazette, and we've also had individuals from our organisations travel to other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and have difficulty entering because of this Gazette list. And I want to reiterate, they're on this list for simply speaking up against the government. It's for no other actual physical activity. They are not terrorists. They simply questioned the government of the day.
Are these lists shared with Interpol? Like, have people had the same kind of problems that was just raised?
I'm not sure if it's shared with Interpol, but you can literally just Google it. It's right there. Google Sri Lankan Gazette terrorist list, and you can check whether your name is listed there. And they update it frequently. They've taken names off. People's names have been added back on. But the moment you know your name is there, that's pretty much a done deal.
So they're not even trying to hide this?
Oh, no, it's not hidden. It's right there in the open, in your face. Yeah, yeah.
And I think I have about 30 seconds left, so just very quickly, you talked about family back home being threatened based on things that people are doing in other countries around the world. Is this common? Is this something that is tracked in any way?
100%. So surveillance goes on constantly in Sri Lanka of families of victims. It's constant. It doesn't matter if an individual has left Sri Lanka or is still there. the fact that somebody had made a complaint means their entire family is surveilled. We've seen reports from the UN where they've recorded accounts of families being, knocked on the door in the middle of the night, phone calls in the middle of the day. And the surveillance can be your simple police officer at the end of the street who is surveilling you. And this is not just victims of other, human rights violations, also of enforced disappearances. We're hearing of the actual mothers who have had direct interactions with the police and army just simply for being a parent of a missing person. So, in all the cases where we've tried to submit submissions or papers and we've tried to get victim statements, people have not wanted to come forward for fear of what might happen to their family back home.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Now I invite Mr. Brunel Dissep to take the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Wee, last November 19th, we witnessed something extremely different for both those from Hong Kong and the diaspora. The sentence pronounced by the High Court in regard to 45 pro-democracy activists for their participation in demonstrations in 2020 and sentences from 4 to 10 years. Does this type of demonstration of force by a totalitarian regime, such as the one that exists in Hong Kong now, does that demotivate? Does it discourage the diaspora abroad? Is the impact that people are more frightened to speak out publicly against the regime when these actions take place?
For sure. Thank you for mentioning the 45 activists. They were sentenced to jail last week, and some of them are close friends of mine, actually. I think what happened to Hong Kong in the past few years have a profound impact on the diaspora, the entire Hong Kong community. Many of them left Hong Kong because of that. And even when they left Hong Kong and residing in safe country, in the US and Canada or in the UK or elsewhere in democracies, they don't feel safe to speak up. And there's a general fear to speak up, and the general sense of self-censorship is happening. A lot less people are willing to speak up on, to touch on the situation in Hong Kong on their social media, even in interpersonal exchange with their friends or family. They, as I said, they don't want to associate with people who continue to be outspoken because they are afraid that they would also be targeted.
Thank you.
When they
Thank you, Madam Louis. Thank you. Mr. John, you have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Okay. So I think I want to go back to Ms. Wei. I started with a question, and we ran out of time in terms of, what more can be done to ensure the safety of and the prevention of silencing of women, political activists, and human rights defenders, especially around, women that are dissidents, fleeing transnational repression. And you just started, you had 10 seconds. I think I want to give you some more time to talk about that, and also about Ms. Kwan's efforts to pressure the Minister of Foreign Affairs to withdraw privileges and immunities for the Hong Kong economic and trade offices, and really how can foreign governments effectively counter transnational repression by the PRC while managing those economic and political pressures at the same time. And I think you got 2 minutes to reply, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll just go back and say we should define transnational repression in the law and criminalize these threats. It should be in the law, the definition of transnational repression. Second, I think this applies to victims, and especially to women victims. We need to provide victim support with emotional support, legal support, and personal support. And third, trainings and education with agencies on how they can handle these reports on transnational repression. We need trainings on victims, on civil society and human rights defenders, especially those that are most vulnerable to these repression, to know what are the resources available for them, what they can do when certain things happen, and what they should do to prevent themselves from the harm. The last thing I would talk about, I think it would be great if we can increase the capacity of law enforcement and intelligence agency to counter foreign influence in a coordinated way. Maybe a hotline should be set up for targets of transnational repression to report these cases to corresponding agencies. Perhaps a commission could even be set up that handles these reports and also responsible for interagency coordination, so that all the federal agencies that are doing this can coordinate and counter that in a more coordinated way.
Thank you, Madam Louise. You exceed the time for 15 seconds. Thank you. Of the committee and the staff, I would like to thank both witnesses. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your testimony, for your declaration. It's very interesting to our committee. If you feel that may other information be interested to the committee, please feel free to write to the clerk or to myself. I would like to thank